In June 2020, after years of protesting and public debate, the American Museum of Natural History in New York City announced that the equestrian statue of Theodore Roosevelt would finally be removed. For indigenous groups, grassroots activists, and other critics of the monument, this wasn't a sudden victory. These people have been working for years to call attention to the racist ideals depicted in this statue. Roosevelt on horseback, flanked by a Native American man and an African man, both on foot, both positioned below him, a literal rendering of racial hierarchy cast in bronze. The city of New York, which owns the monument and the museum, both have resisted this change. But when the Black Lives Matter protests swept through New York City following the murder of George Floyd, the removal was approved. As Mayor Bill de Blasio put it, the museum has asked to remove the Theodore Roosevelt statue because it explicitly depicts Black and Indigenous people as subjugated and racially inferior. The city supports the museum's request. It is the right decision and the right time to remove this problematic statue. But this removal isn't just about one statue or one president or one moment. It's part of a much older and bigger tradition and cycle, the destruction, protest, and reinvention that stretches from the beginning of human civilization. This video essay will explore iconoclasm, what it is, and why people do it, and how the recent wave of monument destruction in North America and the UK fits into this narrative, and also how the more modern invention of the museum plays a role. Iconoclasm literally means image breaking, but that definition doesn't give the full context and history behind the term. Iconoclasm is a cultural, political, religious act that is about power and who gets to define the past, shape the present, and imagine the future. Professor James Simpson from Harvard outlines the way iconoclasm unfolds in 6 stages. The first stage is unlicensed iconoclasm. The people rise up against a ruler, god, or any other authority figure. Think of the way protesters have pulled down statues in Raleigh, George Washington set fire to in Portland, or even splashing red paint on the Roosevelt statue in 2017. The second stage is licensed iconoclasm. Eventually, authority will back the people and the destruction will become an approved and legalized action. Now, the city has complied with the request of the people and removed the Roosevelt statue. The third stage is the resurgence of images. Even after destruction is attempted, the idea and images remain and will eventually reinvent itself. I believe that this is the stage we are in right now with the recent National Garden of American Heroes proposed by the Trump administration, or even museums using the materials of, or even the statues themselves in exhibits. The fourth stage is renewed or institutionalized destruction. I don't think we have seen this in our recent cycle, but eventually we will swing the other way again, and another wave of image destruction will occur. The fifth stage is museum culture. Eventually, the smashed or contested images or icons will re-enter culture as part of history, as curated artifacts. This will remove the religious or political weight it originally held, effectively sterilizing its meaning so it becomes a piece of history. We can see the beginnings of this stage even now with some museums, which we will talk about later on. The sixth stage, safe iconoclasms, is closely related to the fifth stage, where within the museum, the destruction of images becomes an object of study. The museum becomes a sanctuary for icons and for the narratives that justify their destruction. Iconoclasm is not a new phenomenon. This is a cycle that has been repeating since heritage and culture was in existence. Hebrew kings smashed the icons and temples of the Canaanite cities and gods. Christian mobs in late antiquity destroyed pagan statues. Protestants during the Reformation destroyed Catholic images. And even in America, on July 9, 1776, New Yorkers toppled and melted a massive statue of King George III, turning the metal into bullets to shoot British soldiers. Iconoclasm erupts when a society is in crisis, when institutions lose legitimacy, and when instability racks through the social order. Iconoclasm announces that there needs to be a change in the order of things, or one has already been made, and the images no longer match the ideals of a society. It is not an anarchist act that is seemingly aimless. It is an attempt to define a new identity. In Western global consciousness, iconoclasm often evokes an image of an Islamic extremist group destroying religious heritage. One of the most famous instances of this is the Taliban blowing up the Bamiyan Buddhas in 2001. While extremist groups and societies in times of armed conflict have perpetuated destruction of heritage sites, either for religious convictions or reaping the financial benefits of a black art market, the whole story of the Bamiyan Buddhas is not based on these ideas. Campion, a scholar in terrorism and extremism, notes that jihadi iconoclasm is tied to the fourth religious wave of modern terrorism and not random violence. This act is based on a symbolic performance related to the concepts of al-Wala wala bara, which means centering what Allah loves and rejecting what he dislikes, which includes idols. Destroying monuments helps these extremist groups craft an identity that ties them to early Islamic ancestors. Yet, the Bamiyan Buddhas add a complex layer to these ideas. For a millennium, the Bamiyan Buddhas stayed intact under Islamic leadership. The Taliban itself initially placed non-Islamic religious heritage under protection. So why were they targeted? It was because they were famous and public. Their destruction would generate global publicity. Campion argues that the act was less about anarchic destruction of heritage, but more about asserting religious authenticity, defying UN sanctions, and demonstrating autonomy under international pressures. It was a broadcast media event that was planned, showing that the iconoclasm was less about removing the actual object, but more about the message it sent and the identity affirmed. Now, let's take a closer look at the Roosevelt statue after learning about the context of iconoclasm. The Roosevelt statue, created by James Earl Fraser and unveiled in 1940, was meant to honor Roosevelt as a devoted naturalist, but again, the composition points towards a white supremacist message. As protests and public discontent over that statue increased, in 2019, the museum attempted to compromise between public opinion and the statue. They had an exhibition to contextualize the statue. Included in this was a plaque that read, "Some see the statue as a heroic group, others as a symbol of racial hierarchy," which was a statement so wishy-washy that didn't quell discontent in the slightest. However, it was only after the murder of George Floyd and the subsequent protests, which include mass monument removals across the country, that the museum removed the statue. The American Museum of Natural History faced a conundrum here. Museums are meant to be figures in cultural production and preservation of that culture. But when the public no longer agrees with the ideology that the museum is projecting through these monuments, how do they grapple with preserving said historical ideology and staying at the forefront of public opinion? A similar issue has arisen in Bristol, England. Protesters toppled a statue of the slave trader Edward Colston and tossed it into the harbor. For protesters, this was a reclaiming of public space and therefore public identity. But the statue was retrieved and placed in the M. Shub Museum, still with paint splatters and dents. The museum wanted to create a place for conversation and consensus by taking visitor surveys. But by doing this, the energy and urgency of the protest was halted and historicized. Church, a writer for Hypallergic, argues that placing the toppled statues into a museum, the activism and cultural moments that gave it meaning were neutralized and turned into an artifact rather than an ongoing argument. These monuments or statues can only hold meaning as long as they are free for public interaction. When they are allowed to remain on their pedestals, they reflect authority and power. By tossing them into rivers, they symbolize a change in what the public desires and in their leadership. In a museum, they become objects that have lost meaning and, in a sense, have become dead. In the last decade, we have seen what art historian Kat Dawson has described as a monument boom. This is not a resurgence of the classic bronze statues, but artists reimagining what monuments can be. Carol Walker's A Subtlety, a giant sugar-coated sphinx installed in the deteriorating Domino sugar factory, subverted the traditional monument to address the stories of slavery, consumerism, and exploitation in sugar. She used the impermanence of her material as a type of undoing of the traditional monument. The temporality changes the immortal image many have of the monument, which I would argue is more in line with the actual meaning of images and monuments. These things shouldn't be immortal because society is ever-changing along with its ideologies and heroes. Artists today have used impermanence, ephemera, Afrofuturist visions, queer reimaginings, and everyday figures to change the meaning of the word monument. But there is a paradox with these new monuments. They tend to exist inside museums, institutions that have been founded in imperialist extraction and exclusion of diverse voices. Even the most radical artists must comply with the whims of their sponsors and patrons if they want a platform for their art. While artists push for new narratives, there are forces pushing back. As previously mentioned, the Trump administration's proposed National Garden of American Heroes will reinstall removed Confederate statues. Monuments are a battleground of identity and a mirror of societal values, and by that standard cannot be neutral politically, artistically, or otherwise. What does the removal of the Roosevelt statue really mean? It's not just a reaction to protest or a gesture of institutional accountability. It's a part of a cycle that reflects the fear, values, and hopes of society. Iconoclasm is not the end of material heritage or history, but is the negotiation of how people want to remember that history. The question isn't whether monuments should be destroyed, but what should be built in their place. What values and heroes do we want in place of old ones? The great-grandson of Roosevelt said, in response to the removal, "The world does not need statues, relics of another age that reflect neither the values of the person they intend to honor, nor the values of equality and justice." Though we could argue about the values of the person it honors, I think this quote nicely sums up the larger idea of monuments, which are values, which is intrinsically also tied up in the idea of museums, which are meant to preserve and teach about the values of past generations. But do the historical background and institutionality of museums prevent them from being able to support modern artists and ideas fully? Will artists' voices end up being stifled by the platform the museums claim to provide? I believe a change must be made, either in the sponsorship of artists connected to museums or in the way that museums address their institutional biases. This could be done in a number of ways, such as an overhaul of a museum's board's elitist private collectors, or working more collaboratively with the community, centering indigenization and focusing on access for both patrons and artists. Museums are, in a way, a response to iconoclasm, as James Simpson posited in his 6 stages of iconoclasm. Museums want to protect the heritage of the past, but that might remove meaning. Does this mean they should be involved in cultural production? Should museums only become a piece of the past? A new exhibit in LA, Monuments, has provided a potential solution. A predominantly Black group of artists were led by the previously mentioned Kara Walker to use about a dozen removed Confederate memorials to create new art. Artists combined the old parts of Confederate statues to make new art with new meaning from an inherited American past. By using the materials of the past, they are able to recognize social ideologies that are inherently harmful and have heavy history, and how it affects society now, while also moving to a more hopeful future.